Okay, we're going to talk about cell transport. So the plasma membrane is the main thing responsible for cellular transport. Every living cell is going to need some sort of liquid environment to survive, and that's because that liquid environment allows the movement of molecules that the cell needs to survive. Things like oxygen and carbon dioxide, water, different molecules of sugar and other compounds that the cell will need for food. The plasma membrane is selectively permeable, meaning it allows only certain molecules in or out, and others it keeps out. Now, it's usually decided based on size or charge, whether or not the molecule is allowed through the plasma membrane. Remember, the plasma membrane is made out of a phospholipid bilayer, a carbohydrate, okay, and protein channels. Protein channels are used for moving things in and out of the cell, so things that can't go straight through the plasma membrane. So the plasma membrane, remember, is made up of phospholipid heads and two tails, okay, and the tails are pointing in towards each other, and the phospholipid heads are all on the outside. Also on the outside are the carbohydrates that are used to send signals to other cells, and these proteins which go all the way through the cell membrane or the plasma membrane. Some proteins are called channel proteins. These channel proteins have small holes in which different molecules that are nice and small can fit through and flow in or out of the cell freely. Now, there are two types of transport. There's passive transport and active transport. Passive transport is done via diffusion, okay, diffusion. Diffusion is the idea that particles tend to move from an area where they are more concentrated or crowded to an area where they are less concentrated. This is called diffusion. Oops. So here we have an area that is highly concentrated, and over here we have a low concentration of these molecules, and they will, by random motion, okay, basically these molecules are always moving, and by random motion they will end up so that they are evenly distributed throughout the area. Okay, in cells, substances can diffuse across membranes without using energy, and this is called passive transport. You may not be able to see that down there, but this is called passive transport. Okay, so without using energy, when molecules move from high concentration to low concentration, that's called passive transport. Another form of passive transport is called osmosis. Osmosis is the diffusion of water across a selectively permeable membrane. So basically, over here, okay, we have a bunch of water molecules, and over here we have a bunch of solute, or things that are dissolved in the water. Okay, and notice we have a lot fewer water molecules. Now, if we let it go, essentially these water molecules will move over so that they are evenly distributed between this and this, okay? So it will even out. So this enables the cell membrane to regulate its cell's internal environment. Remember, regulation of the internal environment is called homeostasis. Okay, so again, if you see the water molecules here and the water molecules here, there's a lot more here, and over time they'll move so that there is more on the other side, okay? Now, osmosis also affects cells depending on the type of solution that they are placed in. So here, okay, if I were to put a cell in here, there is a lot of solute or a lot of dissolved molecules in this water. Okay, that would be, depending on how it compares to the concentration of those same molecules inside the cell, might be considered one of these different types of solutions. So, if a cell is placed in an isotonic solution, that means the concentration inside the cell and outside the cell are the same. So the concentration of solute or dissolved things, so maybe dissolved oxygen, dissolved carbon dioxide, dissolved whatever. If it is a hypertonic solution, that means the concentration outside the cell is greater than the concentration inside the cell. Okay, and if it is hypotonic solution, it is the concentration outside the cell is less than the concentration inside the cell. So here's your example. So here's the cell right here. Here, if you look, this is outside the cell, and there's only one piece of solute, only one thing that's dissolved. If you look inside the cell, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So this is called a hypotonic solution because it says this is lower amounts of solute than in here. An isotonic solution is one where there is the same amount of solute inside the cell as there is outside the cell. So if I count these solute molecules, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, they are the same. So essentially, they're going to want to move back and forth and always come to an equilibrium. Hypertonic solution. Now, in the hypertonic solution, that means the amount of solute outside the cell is much higher than the solution inside the cell. So if you count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then you count all of these out here, quite obviously there's way more than 6. So here is a hypertonic solution. Now, cells react different ways in hypotonic, isotonic, and hypertonic solutions. And we'll talk more about what that looks like later. But just understand that if I put a cell in each of these, they're going to react a little different. And plant cells are going to react a little bit different than animal cells. Okay, so passive transport or facilitated diffusion. So we already talked about regular diffusion. So most of the time, molecules can diffuse straight across the membrane. But there are some times when they can't. And when they can't, there are those protein channels in the membrane that allow them to flow through. So facilitated diffusion is when molecules that cannot diffuse on their own because of size or charge move through protein channels in the membrane. So the outside of the cell, look at how much solute we have, and then they can move through these channels. They can't fit through here, but they can move through these channels to get into the cell to the lower concentration. And this is a type of passive transport. Now we're going to move on to active transport. So passive transport did not require energy. Active transport does require energy. It also requires usually some sort of protein carrier to help move particles across the membrane. And it's usually against the concentration gradient. So if you remember when we were talking about diffusion before, we said it moves from high concentration to low concentration. Now, in active transport, it's actually going to do the opposite. It's going to take energy to move things from a low concentration to a high concentration. So if you look here, we have very little solute outside. We have a lot inside, but we are using energy, or ATP, to pump these molecules into the cell against the concentration gradient, or up the concentration gradient. There is also this idea of exocytosis and endocytosis. So if you don't use the channels, if you have something that's even bigger than those things that are in the channels, you would use exocytosis or endocytosis. Exocytosis means, exo means out, is when large particles are released from the cell by secreting them or expelling them. Endocytosis, endo means in, are large particles that are engulfed, then enclosed by the cell membrane and moved into the cell. So endocytosis brings large things in, exocytosis takes large things out. And here's an example of that. So if we are ready to go ahead and leave this, so we have our Golgi membrane here, it pinches off into a vesicle, and then that vesicle joins with the plasma membrane, releasing all that stuff out into the cell. Exocytosis means we're taking it out. Endocytosis, there's something very large here that we want to come in, and so we make a vesicle out of the plasma membrane and it's able to travel into the cell. Alright, so that is the general idea of plasma membrane. I do want to show you a couple of things just to be quite clear about how things work.
Are you wearing my mom's perfume? That's, Dear Tim and Moby, how do our cells take in oxygen and other stuff from Mahmood? Cells get everything they need from their environment. The cells in your body hang out in an environment of blood, which contains oxygen, water, food, and whatever else they might need to function. How does stuff get in and out of cells? Well, cells are surrounded by protective membranes, but the membranes are selectively permeable. They let some things in and keep others out. The membranes have tiny pores in them that allow certain substances, like water and oxygen, to pass through. These substances can move through the membrane without the use of energy on the cell's part. This movement is called passive transport. The cell doesn't have to do anything to make it happen. It just sits there and lets the water, nutrients, and whatever else pass through. Now, passive transport works by diffusion. That's the natural spreading of particles through a liquid or a gas. Molecules naturally spread from high concentration areas to low concentration areas. These differences in concentration are called gradients. Substances are said to diffuse down concentration gradients. Eventually, everything gets evenly mixed and a state of equilibrium or balance is reached. If you've ever smelled flowers from across a room, you've experienced the effects of diffusion. How does diffusion relate to our cells? Okay, let's say there are more oxygen molecules outside a cell than inside. Because oxygen can pass through a cell membrane, diffusion will even out the concentration of oxygen molecules inside and outside the cell. That's how our cells get the oxygen and water they need to survive. Diffusion actually works for getting rid of substances too. As carbon dioxide builds up inside of a cell, it diffuses through the membrane and into the surrounding blood, which has a lower CO2 concentration. Healthy cells maintain a state of dynamic equilibrium. Substances are constantly diffusing across cell membranes to even out the differences. Sometimes a cell will move substances up the concentration gradient. And food particles like glucose are too big to get through the gaps in the cell membrane. When a cell has to use energy to move substances across its membrane, it's called active transport. But that's really a whole other subject. No, I just won't discuss it right now.
Okay. Now we are going to look really quickly at active transport.
I think you might need to use the special entrance. Dear Tim and Moby, what is active transport? Queen. Funny you should ask. Active transport is one way that substances get in and out of a cell. In order to do that, they need to penetrate the cell membrane. Some substances, like oxygen and water molecules, move through the gaps in the membrane without any effort on the part of the cell. Because the cell expends no energy, this is called passive transport. Passive transport works by diffusion. That's the natural spreading of particles through a liquid or gas. Particles move from areas of high concentration to areas of lower concentration. Yep, this is called moving down a concentration gradient. Not all substances can cross a cell membrane without some help. Active transport is when a cell uses its own energy to move molecules across the membrane. Well, take plants for example. Root cells in plants often need to absorb minerals from the surrounding soil, even when their cells already contain higher concentrations of those minerals. Well, diffusion would cause the cells to actually lose minerals, so the cells have to work to keep their minerals in and take in more. To do this, cells use transport proteins, complex molecules lodged in the membrane. The transport protein binds with the needed substance, then changes its shape to move the substance inside the membrane, where it's released. In order to work, transport proteins need ATP, the main source of cell energy. Sometimes cells absorb substances by another form of active transport called endocytosis. That's when the cell membrane surrounds a substance and engulfs it. The membrane pinches off into a little sphere called a vesicle or a vacuole, and voila, the substance is now inside the cell. The white blood cells in your immune system absorb and kill germs using endocytosis. Cells can expel large molecules through exocytosis. Alright, that's basically a reversal of endocytosis. Substances that need to be released are enclosed in a vesicle, which fuses with the cell membrane. then whatever's inside the vesicle gets released outside the cell.